Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling something a little different today. Something you might not think is exciting. Fractions.
Fractions, you say?
I know. It sounds a little dry, like back to school time. But trust me on this. Today's deep dive is all about uncovering how fractions shape the world around us. And we're not talking about just, slicing pies.
Right, because fractions pop up in the most unexpected places.
Exactly. In fact, we're going to kick things off with something you see practically every day, but might not have really looked at through this lens before. Flags.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Flags and fractions, lay it on me.
So we've been digging into this really interesting source, for partsandwholes.pdf, and it points out how fractions are basically the secret code behind a lot of flag designs.
Secret code, huh? I like it.
Right. Like, take the Indian flag, for instance.
Yep.
Those equal bands of saffron, white, and green, they're not just there because they look pretty together. Each color represents 13 of the flag.
That's a really clear example of how fractions can be so visually striking. But what's even more fascinating is what those colors symbolize. Saffron represents courage and sacrifice. White represents peace and truth. And green stands for growth and prosperity.
Wow, I never knew that. So it's not just about dividing up the flag into equal parts, it's also about what those parts represent.
Exactly. When you start breaking down a flag using fractions, you're uncovering layers of history, symbolism, meaning, all woven into its design.
It really makes you think, right? Like, have you ever stopped to think about the math behind the designs you see all the time?
It's like this whole hidden language. And once you start seeing these mathematical relationships, you start to see them everywhere. Take the Myanmar flag, for example. We've got yellow, green, and red. Just by looking at it, you can tell that red makes up more than 14 of the flag, but definitely less than half.
So we're intuitively understanding fractions just by looking at it.
Exactly. Our brains are wired for this kind of visual processing, even if we don't always realize it.
Okay, that's super cool. But for partsandwholes.pdf doesn't just stop at flags. It goes way beyond, these visual representations to show us how fractions help us navigate real-world scenarios.
Real-world scenarios like what?
Like everything, from dividing up a pan of, say, halwa, that delicious South Asian dessert.
I'm always up for halwa.
Right. So imagine dividing a plate of halwa into thirds. Each person gets 13 of the total.
It's a simple way to illustrate a fundamental principle representing equal parts of a whole.
Precisely. And the source takes us even further with things like inheritance disputes. There's this really interesting story, An Old Woman's Will.
Okay, an old woman and her will. I'm all ears.
So this old woman wants to divide her 19 camels among her 3 daughters. But here's the catch. She wants to do it using very specific fractions.
19 camels. That's oddly specific. And also, who divides camels using fractions?
Right. It's a little quirky, but it highlights how people have been using fractions to solve problems, even really complex ones, for centuries. It's not just some modern invention. It's rooted in history. But you know what I really appreciate about for partsandwholes.pdf?
What's that?
It does a great job of grounding these concepts, making them feel relatable. Like, there's this whole section about a child's daily schedule and how it's divided into fractions.
Okay, tell me more about that. How do they use a child's schedule to explain fractions?
So they break down a typical day, studying, playing, sleeping, all that, and they represent each activity as a fraction of the whole day. And it really gets you thinking about how much time we spend on different things. Like, what fraction of our day is dedicated to work, to family, to just relaxing.
Wow, that's actually a really insightful way to think about it. It's not just about the math. It's about understanding our own lives through this lens of fractions.
Right. And speaking of understanding things in a different way, for partsandwholes.pdf throws in a really fun curveball with its section on puzzles and patterns.
Puzzles. Now you're speaking my language. Tell me more.
So there's this one activity called Guess and Check, where you have to visually divide shapes into equal parts.
I love those kinds of visual puzzles. It's like a workout for your brain.
Exactly. And it really helps you understand fractions, not just by, memorizing formulas, but by actually seeing how it works.
So it's about spatial reasoning rather than just rote memorization.
Exactly. And then there's this other puzzle, the card puzzle. It's really clever. You use these fraction cards to color in a circle, and it ends up connecting fractions to things like probability and strategy.
That's brilliant. I love how they're finding all these different ways to engage with fractions.
Right. It's not just about boring math problems. It's about finding those aha moments that make it click.
And you know what? Engaging with patterns like that, it's not just good exercise for our brains. It actually activates the reward centers in our brains.
So learning about fractions can actually feel good.
That's the idea. When we make those connections, solve those puzzles, it's like our brain is giving us a little pat on the back. And that makes us want to learn more.
Wow, who knew fractions could be so, dare I say, fun?
4. Partsandwholes.pds is full of surprises like that.
Okay.
It's constantly pushing us to look beyond the surface and discover this whole hidden world of fractions all around us.
Okay, so we've gone from flags to desserts, even to puzzles, and it all comes back to fractions. But you might be thinking, so what? What's the big takeaway here?
You know, that's the thing about this 4. Partsandwholes.pdf, it doesn't just teach us about fractions. It opens our eyes to how they're everywhere in our lives.
Totally. Like, remember Kirti's shopping list? They've got a whole section about that.
Oh yeah, Kirti and those gourds. That's brilliant. They use something as ordinary as grocery shopping to show us how practical fractions are.
Right, like Kirti's buying, what, 2¼ kilograms of gourds? And the price is per kilogram? Suddenly you need your fractions to figure out how much she's paying.
It's like, if you don't get fractions, you're stuck hoping the cashier got it right. And that's just vegetables. This is about understanding money, comparing prices, making good choices at the store. Fractions give you that power.
It's about taking control. But it's bigger than just money. This source, 4, partsandwholes.pdf, it also goes into how fractions affect time, our schedules even.
They had that part about train schedules, right?
Yeah, the Mangalore Express was running behind, like half an hour late. That's fractions in action.
It's how we talk about time all the time, those little delays, how long till we get somewhere. We just don't think, hey, that's math.
We're practically fluent in fractions without knowing it. But this, partsandwholes.pdf, it pushes you to use fractions for problem solving, too. Like that story about the old woman's will.
Oh, man, that one.
Yeah.
It was almost like a joke, you know, like who divides up camels with fractions? But it makes a point. When we're splitting inheritances, things get complicated, and those fractions matter.
She had to think outside the box to make those fractions work. But what I really like is how 4 partsandwholes.pdf connects this to, like, our own time management. Remember Aaron's timetable?
Oh, yeah, they broke down his whole day, every activity, each a fraction of his time.
Yeah.
It really made you see how we use our hours.
And it makes you ask yourself, am I spending my time right? What's my own timetable look like? What's important enough to get a big fraction of my day?
Exactly. This for partsandwholes.pdf. It blends practical stuff with making you think, even a little self-reflection, all because of fractions.
And it shows us they're not just numbers. They're tools. We can use them to figure out our world and ourselves.
That's the beauty of it, right? It's a whole new way of looking at things, all thanks to fractions.
It's like we're learning this whole new language, and the words are fractions.
That's a great way to put it. And the more we use this language, the more we understand, right? Like, for partsandwholes.pdf has this section, from a part to the whole. It really shows this.
From a part to the whole. Okay, what's that all about?
Picture this.
Yeah.
They give you a piece of picture, like a fraction of it. And you have to figure out the whole thing. Maybe it's like 1/3 of a flower, and you have to draw the missing petals.
Yeah.
Or half a fan, and you got to complete it.
Oh, like those brain teasers, those visual puzzles.
Yes, exactly. It's not just about fractions. It's how our brains work, filling in the blanks.
And you realize one fraction, like 1/4, could be so many different things. 1/4 of a watermelon, 1/4 of a cake.
Exactly. Same fraction, totally different things. Context is key with fractions. That's what this shows us.
It's not just a number on its own, it's part of a bigger picture. And speaking of this source, they bring it back to money again, right? Rupees and pays, that section.
Smart move, right. They take something familiar, Indian currency, and bam, fractions are real again. 25 pays. It's not just a coin. It's 1/4 of a rupee. Boom, fractions in action.
Makes it click for people. Suddenly, it's not just about passing a test. It's about, like, understanding prices, being a smart shopper.
Being in control. That's the power fractions can give you. And this whole partsandwholes.pdf, that's been the theme, hasn't it? Fractions aren't just math class stuff. They're everywhere.
We started with flags, right? And we went to inheritances, shopping lists, even how we spend our own time. Who knew fractions could be so big?
It's a credit to this source, really. They took something we probably haven't thought about since we were kids, and they made it fascinating again.
They made it relevant. Not just formulas, but how we see the world. So next time you see a fraction on a recipe, a sale sign, anywhere, don't just glaze over. Think about it. You might surprise yourself with what you discover. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of fractions. Turns out, it's a pretty amazing place.